Hello, and welcome to Brokenomics, and in this episode we're going to be looking at the fourth turning. The fourth turning is an absolutely fascinating concept. It's entered common parlance at this point. A lot of people talk about it. It's a book that has been especially popular amongst finance people, and it's referred to sort of offhand now. You often hear people saying that, we're in a fourth turning now, and I thought it was really worth getting stuck into this book because it gives us quite a good lens, actually, to understand what's going on, why history might be cyclical, why generations act the way they do, and get into the meat of it, because it's an important concept. It's a useful model for understanding the world as it is. It is going to get a tiny bit boomery bashing. Can't be helped. I've been very kind to the baby boomers so far in this series, but the guy who wrote this book, well, two of them, both of them are boomers. Their interpretation of history is not as kind as it could be to that generation, but there are good reasons for it, and it describes why. So let's explain that. So the fourth turning, oversimplified, is, and I'm sure you've heard this meme, it's the good times. Strong men create good times is the way it starts. Good times create weak men. Weak men create bad times, and bad times create strong men, and the cycle repeats again. That's essentially the simple form of this concept, although they get significantly deeper than that, and we get into it. It was expressed in a book called The Fourth Turning, an American Prophecy. What history tells us about America's next rendezvous with history. And it was written by a couple of guys called William Strauss and Neil Howe, and they wrote that in the early 90s. It was published in 1997. And it was actually one of a series of books that they produced. The first one was called Generations, and they've got another one which is coming out fairly soon, which I'd like to talk about, which is why talking about the fourth turning now is an ideal opportunity. And perhaps if anyone knows Neil and they can introduce me to him, I'd love to get him on Brokenomics for when the new book comes out. Right, before we do that, let's cover the existing existing book and the existing theory, because it is so useful. Essentially, what it does is it gives us this generational theory of history that's based on generational changes. So the theory is often known as the Strauss-Howe generational theory. And basically what it says is that history is shaped by the people within it, obviously, but more specifically the generations of the people that are in it, and that those generations are in turn shaped by history as they go through life, as they go through their adolescent years, and then when they come into their main, when they come into positions of power, the upbringing that they had and the phase of history that they're in then goes on to shape that next phase in history. So let's look at this across the piece by looking at this table. So this effectively shows the theory in graphical form, and let's go through it. What it says is that history is divided into blocks. And each of these blocks is about the length of a long human life. So it's something in the realm of 80 to 100 years for each block. And each block is divided into 4 turnings. Each of these turnings are somewhere between 20 and 25 years across. And each of the turnings is called, in turn, a high, an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis. So we're just going to look at each of these in turn, and then we're going to look at each of the generations that comes with it. Now, the generations, they are the prophets. These are the people who have their formative years during the high. So they're born into good times. Then you've got the nomads. These are the people who are born into the second turning, the awakening, when a lot of the theory that went into creation of the high starts to get questioned. Then you get the heroes, and they are born into the unraveling turning as the generational norms, the societal norms start to become undone. And then finally you have the artists, who are born into the crisis period, the fourth turning. So, the high. This is a period of strong institutions and a sense of collective destiny. And you've got to remember, this high period, it follows an immediate crisis before. So everybody has had to get through the crisis, and they've had to work together on a strong sense of collective identity. So individualism is weak during this period, but institutions and community is strong. Okay, this would have been, in our most recent example, the post-war period of Second World War. Now then there's the awakening. The awakening, as you can see from the chart, that would have been about mid-60s to maybe mid-80s. This is a time when people who grew up during that high period, who would have been children over this time, now they're starting to enter the workforce. They're starting to enter academia, they're starting to get involved, and they don't have any memory of the crisis period that led to the high that they're now living in. So they're really starting to question. They're starting to say, what are the values here? They're starting to push for their own individuality away from institutions. It can be a sort of spiritual awakening. It can be protests. But essentially what's happening is these institutions are being attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy. The third turning, the unraveling. Now, that's a period of disunity, distrust, pessimism, and the old order really starts to come apart during this period. There's a strong push for individuality, personal autonomy, the pursuit of self-interest, and the idea of the collective really starts to get defamed in this period. And then you have the crisis. It is a period of upheaval. It's a period of destruction where people are emphatically against the sort of collective community spirit, and there's a strong sense of urgency that things need to go through dramatic change. We're trying to replace old institutions. Those old institutions, of course, don't want to be replaced, and the period of crisis is a disruption that leads way to the next time. Now, all of this will make a lot more sense when we start to put it into historical context, going back over our most recent experience, although this does work over quite long periods. So, according to Strauss and Howe, these turnings are driven by these generational changes, and each generation has its own characteristics. They've got their own common beliefs, they're shaped by their experiences, their formative years, and it results in 4 distinctive generational archetypes. Now, these are the prophets. Like I say, these are people who were born during the high. They grew up as very indulged children because, of course, their parents have recently lived through a very difficult crisis period. And they come into their own during the awakening, and they spend their midlife in the unraveling. So the prophets, an example for us would be the boomers. They grew up in the immediate post-war period. They entered the workforce during the awakening, so this would have been the sort of mid-60s to the 80s. That's when they're sort of really starting to come into their own. And it is not until the unraveling, when they are basically occupying these positions of power, that causes that unraveling. And then, of course, they basically get us to the crisis, which their push and their drive throughout their life has ultimately led us to as the institutions start to unravel and the social norms start to unravel. And then, of course, they exit the field because, of course, a long human life does only get you to about 80 to 100 years, which is the sort of sample size of this entire turning. Then you've got the nomads. For us, this is going to be Generation X. It's going to be people who grew up, who are the children, in this case, of the silent generation, the people who did actually live through the crisis, the generation that came before the boomers. They are coming into their own when the social norms are already starting to unravel. So they have some recollection of the post-high. They've still got some experience of it, but at this point, the social norms, the institutions are strongly being questioned, and things are starting to break down. Thus the experience of Gen X, and they tend to be quite nihilistic as a result of this. Then we've got the heroes. The heroes are the people who they grew up in a sort of, they grew up in the awakening, and they come of age during the crisis. Now, the former example of heroes is going to be the GI generation or the greatest generation. They're going to be the people who, in the previous crisis, it basically came down to them to fix the ship. So in that previous time, the missionary generation, which would have been the previous cycle's version of the boomers, the nomads, and the lost generation would have been the ones in the position of power. But it was the GI generation, the ones who ultimately charged with charging into the breach and trying to put the ship right after the society had been torn asunder. And the current cycle version of those is going to be the millennials. They fit into the heroes, and we'll talk about more of that. Then, of course, the last generational archetype is going to be the artists. These are it would have been the silent generation, the generation above the boomers, and today, of course, it is the Zoomers. Now, they are born during the crisis period. They tend to grow up with very overprotective adults, who typically would have been the Gen X generation. And their lot in life is to experience the crisis at an age where they're probably a little bit too young to contribute to the resolution of that, or some of the older ones might be able to. And then they go forwards into the high, the restitution of this as the new societal norms are set up, and they start to set things right. So I think now it's appropriate to start getting a little bit deeper into each of these blocks, and we try and fit the theory together. So that high period. So this is the first turning in this theory, and it is a period of strong stability, strong institutions. Because you've got to remember, these people, they've just been through a major crisis. It has been previously. It would have been the war era. It would have been the Great Depression and the war, although we will talk about there's been a number of crises. This theory runs back many, many centuries. And the high is always characterized in a certain way. So very strong institutions, very strong leadership. So the leaders of this time are noteworthy individuals who people can respect. People generally like the government. They generally like the educational bodies. The corporations are strong, well respected. Society functions smoothly. Political leaders tend to be quite pragmatic. They tend to be quite action orientated. They tend to be focused on building, literally building, as well as societal infrastructure, but also literally building. Now, can you imagine that? A generation of people that actually build stuff. We see very little building taking place at the moment, very little infrastructure. I mean, I was wound up recently because it's quite hot at the moment, and I got a hosepipe ban come through the door on some printed piece of card. And I'm looking at this and thinking, well, okay, so the last reservoir in the UK was built in 1991, and the population has increased officially by 26% since then. So you're increasing the population through your mass immigration policies, but you're refusing to build any new infrastructure because, of course, every single penny has to go towards a series of insurance programs, largely for the benefit of the boomers and those who tend to prefer not to work. So yes, that is. But then we're in a crisis period at the moment. But the high periods, in this case, would have been the late 1940s, the 1950s, and the early part of the 1960s. It was a period of a lot of building, a lot of house building went on then, as well as the institutions. There was a very strong community spirit during a high. It's often characterized by a sense of shared values. Society tends to be very cooperative during that period. It is, colloquially, it is the era where you can leave your door unlocked. It prioritizes the greater good over individualism. There's a strong sense of national and civic duty and participation in public life. All of those things are important. It tends to be a period of economic prosperity because wealth is a lot more uniformly distributed at that time. If you remember from one of the previous Brokenomics, we talked about what happened in 1971. And we spent a lot of time looking at graphs showing that wealth has been getting steadily more concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people because of the effects of the fiat money system we talked about, but also the effect of, through the lens of this theory, it's going to be because basically the rules are configured in such a way as to benefit a narrower and narrower group. And after having gone through a crisis, and in this case we're talking about the war, but whatever crisis comes next, any of the previous crises that we talked about, there tends to be a general resetting. There tends to be a reset towards those who are contributing there and then. So effectively a move away from capital towards labour. So the high is characterised by a period of very high equality, effectively. I kind of want to say that. It feels like a leftist term, but that is literally what it's saying. There tends to be a far more robust middle class and decent social safety nets as well as along with that community spirit. The high tends to be a period of a lot of innovation and construction. It's a time of building, so lots of infrastructure, as I mentioned, lots of social norms. Cultural expression tends to emphasize all of those values. And there's a big focus on the future. It's often marked by a time of optimism and forward-looking perspective. And there's this sense that society is progressing towards something that is going to be better than the past. Certainly something that we don't feel at the moment. However, from the perspective of some people in it, some people who are, growing up in this era, who haven't experienced the previous crisis, there can also be a sense that there is too much conformity. They feel that the social consensus is too strong, institutions are too strong, and it leads to a pressure to conform, that it stifles individualism, diversity of thought, and so you start to get those people who feel they're marginalised and they start to challenge the status quo. There's also, perhaps negatively, there's also a lot of complacency during a high. People think that the societal benefits, that they can take them for granted, especially if you're growing up during this, if you haven't experienced the previous crisis. And that sows the seeds for future crises that can come along. Also, this period tends to be fairly technocratic. Because there's a high degree of faith in institutions during this time, it can tend to lead to a fairly technocratic style of governance, because there isn't that sort of vigorous level of debate about what the shape of the society could be, because that has already been determined coming out of the previous crisis. But it is a period of stability, prosperity, strong institutions. So you can see how this fits into the context of the 1950s, which were often regarded as something of a golden age. Okay, then the awakening. This is, if you're going to look at it charitably, you'd say that this is a cultural and spiritual renewal. There's a resurgence of questioning all of the values and norms that were established during the high, and this is accompanied by a shift in focus from materialism and social institutions to individualism and sort of inner growth. And this challenge goes directly to institutions and leadership. So if you think about this in the most recent context, it's going to be, the later 60s and the 70s. And that was indeed exactly what we saw. There was strong pushback against institutions. It was the hippie era. It was challenging. In the UK, of course, we would have had the big union push that we had at that time. And a lot of the challenges, both societally and institutionally, because what you're effectively getting is you're getting that bigger and bigger gender gap. You're getting people who are more and more removed from the period of crisis that came before it, and so they don't understand why the world was set up in the way it was. It's a time of flourishing ideas. It's a time of perhaps it's quite strong in philosophy, religion and art and social theory, However, a lot of this social theory, of course, is going to be quite subversive, and it's going to be a lot of entropy, perhaps, rather than what it would present itself as progress. So the downsides of this awakening era is going to be this is a significant period of increased societal conflicts, social norms, and it starts to lead to a bigger and bigger spirit of divisiveness and tension. And at the time, a lot of this is going to be expressed at this time primarily in the academy, in academia, and the universities. But nevertheless, of course, that ethos is then being pushed out to the students, who will, as we will later see, start to dominate. And it is also an era of a neglect of physical infrastructure. So the enthusiasm has gone out. So the spend on infrastructure starts to tail off. Okay, the third turning, the unraveling. Now, this is a period where institutions are starting to decay at this point. Leadership is getting weaker. So in our case, this would have been the mid-'80s up to about 2008. People are increasingly distrusting their governments, their institutions. There is a greater sense of dissolution with politics. And it leads to a stronger and stronger rise in individualism, greater emphasis on personal autonomy. And as those institutions start to weaken, there's often a push for more decentralized solutions, local control of things, and basically trying to take everything away from those institutions that you can, or attempting to subvert and take over those institutions. So the downside of this era is going to be it's a neglect of the common good. People start to fracture. People no longer, and this book was written from the perspective of an American, so it is less and less emphasis on what it is to be an American, and more emphasis on what it means to be some fractured part of that whole. So an interest group. We tend to see the conflict between the genders and the races and the ages and so on, and basically anything that splits us away from that common collective identity. So society starts to fragment. Social norms start to be heavily attacked during this period. So things like traditional marriage, the unraveling is the period of divorce and the rise of a lot of new sexual identities. And this is not something that's unique to to our current unraveling. As you see in the book, if you want to go and dive into this in much more detail, this is a cycle that is repeated many, many times. There is a push towards more divergent sexualities and ways of expressing yourself, and this typically tends to start to really rise in the unraveling period. Right, and then the crisis. So the strong institutions that everybody lives under, those that were designed in the immediate previous post-crisis period and the end of the crisis period, and became strengthened and renewed during the former high, all of those institutions are still in place. Those are still the governing structures. But during the crisis, those institutions have been significantly weakened. The underlying logic for them has been undermined. So you then start to see an absolute collapse in the standards of leadership. If you look at the politicians we've got today, they are phenomenally weak leaders. They are phenomenally uninspiring people. When you know you're in a crisis because you look at your political leadership and almost everybody thinks, yeah, I could do a better job than that. That is typical of a crisis under this theory, and it's obviously true that we can experience it now. Community spirit has effectively died at this point. Nobody feels that sense of allegiance to the people of the greater good. So, people don't feel an allegiance to each other on the basis simply of being an American. They start to feel, or Brit, they start to feel allegiance to one of their very fractured groups, whatever that might be. But effectively at this point, everybody is sort of largely out for themselves. And it's a complete realignment of ideas and cultures, often with quite bizarre ideas starting to come into this. And of course, the greatest thing about a crisis is that it is often marked by a period of significant violence or disruption, as we find when we start to talk about these past crises. So let's look at a number of these past crises, because this theory basically suggests that you can chop history up into these various blocks, 80 to 100 years, and you can explain this going well back. So if that's the case, we should be able to look at previous crises to see if it fits in, and remarkably, it does incredibly well. So let's go back to War of the Roses. That fits in with a crisis period. That's going to be what's that? The sort of the 1460s to about the mid 1480s. War of the Roses. That was for a crisis period. The Armada crisis. So the attempted invasion of England by the Spanish that occurred in the subsequent crisis block. The Glorious Revolution with King James II in England. That would have been 1675 until the early part of the 1700s. Now, this book was written from the perspective of the Anglos, but it was written by American authors. So after this, after that Anglo history, it sort of transitions fairly seamlessly to the American perspective, but again, it sort of lines up perfectly fine. The next crisis that comes after that from their perspective is going to be the American Revolution. So what's that, 1773 to 1794. This was the period where 13 American colonies declared independence from Britain. Now, really, you can think of that as a civil war. I mean, effectively was. That's how people at the time thought of it. It is often portrayed in modern media as the Americans versus the British, but at the time they didn't have any concept of that. They thought of themselves at the time of British as British. So it would have been, we wouldn't have made any sense to them to put it in the terms that we put it in now. But they would have seen it as a civil war, and that fits into this crisis narrative. Now, again, rolling this forward, another history block, another 80 to 100 years later, and that gets us to the Civil War. So 1860 to 1865, a major crisis in American history, of course, and again, it exactly fits that pattern of rolling forward another block. You go forward one more, and you get the Great Depression, World War II. So we're taking that from about 1929 to 1946. So a period of significant economic downturn followed by a major global war that involved over 30 countries. So you can see this pattern fits. And let's start to fit the generations into it so you can see how this sort of all unfolds together. And we're going to start with the missionary generation, the prophets of their time. So the missionary generation, they were people born in the 1860s to about the early 1880s. These are the people who grew up in the period of calm that followed the US Civil War. And they grew up during a period which was something of a golden age. In fact, it is referred to now as the Gilded Age. There had been a renewal in the social order. There was a huge amount of optimism during this time. Children were well protected. It was a period of very strong economic growth, national confidence, the Civil War's behind us. All of the fractiousness and all of the decay and all of the weak leadership, all of that had been cleared out at that point. And the missionary generation came into this, and they grew up in that Gilded Age. But they lacked the perspective as to why these social norms existed in the way they do, and they started to find it stifling. And so that when they came into their early life, the awakening period from their point of view, they wanted to push back against a lot of this stuff. So that's when you started seeing the emergence of new social movements, things like prohibition and women's suffrage, which, of course, as everybody knows, is one of the worst things that has ever happened to women. Just look at Sweden today.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.